Welcome to Barnyard Language, honest talk about running farms and raising families. We are Caite and Arlene, an Iowa sheep farmer and an Ontario dairy farmer, with 6 kids, 2 husbands, and a whole lot of chaos between us.
While this is a podcast for farm families, sometimes our content isn't for the whole family. So kick off your boots, reheat your coffee, and join us for some Barnyard Language.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to what I think is the final episode of Season 5 of Barnyard Language. Hard to believe that we're already at this point, but usually we take August off, so that means this is your Season 5 ending episode. So Katie and I will be back in September for Season 6, but for now, we're going to take a little break, and you can take this month to get caught up on all those past episodes, because if you're like me, you have a podcast queue that is real long. So, it will give you some time to get caught up, or maybe listen to another podcast. You don't have to be faithful to just us. We get it.
I'm at that point, Arlene, where there's a few podcasts that I subscribe to, which you could subscribe to ours on Patreon as well and get access to not 10 years of back bonus content like some of my shows have. That was a little shocking to realize that I have several shows that offer 10 plus years of bonus content, many of them from more than one podcast at a time, which means that I have, 70 or 80 years worth of podcasts to catch up on.
You're definitely going to get caught up.
And much like ours, some of those podcasts were a little rough in the beginning. So there's always that seeking to find when the show gets to where it's desirable to listen to, let's say. Some of them started out a little rougher sounding than others did.
The origins are the real part, right? I guess. Yes. And our bonus content is these weekly updates on video, so you get to see our various hairstyles, the background of whatever room we happen to be recording in that week. So what is happening on the farm in July in Iowa, Katie?
We just got home from a 4-day trip to a tractor show west of the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
So does that count as excitement for all 4 members of your family, or more so for 2?
I took the kids to a movie theater Friday to see Minions versus Monsters. The big excitement there was that it was fancy by small town standards theater with the heated reclining seats.
Right, footrests, yeah.
Yeah, and they had real butter on the popcorn, which was the most excited I've ever been to pay extra at a movie theater. I will happily pay an extra 50 cents to support our dairy producers and eat something that's not whatever the hell is in normal movie theater butter.
Whatever that liquid is.
Yes, that yellow stuff they put on the popcorn. So that was good. We spent a lot of time in the hotel pool. The Days Inn in Hutchinson, Minnesota has a truly delightful staff who were even kind after I demagnetized our keys twice in the space of 2 hours, and then my kids dumped lettuce all over the floor of the dining room after I told them to be careful. The kids were real careful until they went to pick up the paper from their tacos and promptly dumped all the lettuce they had scooped onto that paper onto the carpet. I guess I should have clarified a little bit more about what that would entail. Got home late-ish Sunday. Not late, but, 5 hours after we thought we were going to be home. The guys are combining oats. I was just telling Arlene our local meat packing plant is on fire, which is very bad news for a lot of folks. They're not reporting any injuries at this point, but it sounds like the building's going to be a total loss, which is several hundred people out of their jobs.
Which in a small town is the only employer, right? Or the main employer?
There is one other employer, but there's certainly not enough to absorb this many families' worth of employment. And most of their employees are immigrants. And many of us know what the situation is like for immigrants in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, so that story is evolving as your phone is blowing up this morning, I'm sure.
Yes. Otherwise, not a whole hell of a lot going on. It's finally cooling off a little bit. Yesterday's real feel was 106 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius, but it's too damn hot. Too hot. Not much else except somebody pointed out that school registration is open and school starts in less than a month here in the Midwest. So take that how you will. How are things at your place, Arlene?
Well, the husband and I left the farm for a week, which we were trying to think back to the last time that he and I were away for that length of time without children. And I think it's maybe been about 10 years-ish since that happened last. So that alone is something to celebrate.
I'm impressed. I would have thought it would have been before you had children.
No, we have done a couple of trips, just the two of us since having kids, but it has been a while. So we were gone for a week. We are part of a dairy co-op. So milk is complicated here, supply management, all that kind of stuff. So we are part of a co-op. That doesn't mean that our milk goes to that co-op. It just means that as dairy producers, we can buy shares in that co-op. So we support the work that they do, but our milk does not necessarily always go to their locations, and they have several of them. So anyway, we're part of this co-op, and I'm a voting delegate in that organization. And so that meant that we were able to go on a delegate trip to Newfoundland. So that was pretty exciting. I have one province left that I haven't visited, and this was my husband Hugh's final province off the list. So we haven't been to all the territories yet, but now he's been to all the provinces, and I still just need to fit in a trip to Saskatchewan someday. So I'm sure we'll work that out. But Newfoundland was beautiful. Everyone kept saying the weather is not normally as nice as it was when we were there. So it was sunny and warm-ish, not hot, which is fine by me. Some days we wore shorts, some days we didn't. But yeah, lots of sea breezes and lots of nature. We got to visit a few dairy farms and, learn about how a lot of things are the same, and they have a lot of challenges as well, being on an island and very far from a lot of places. The logistical challenges of that and a different climate from where we live adds some extra challenges for them too, and landscape that is much rockier than here. So it was neat to meet some other farmers, and the trip was made up of mostly farmers. So, the conversations on the bus were usually around crops and cows and all the things that farmers talk about when they get together. And we also got to do some touristy stuff and visit some other co-ops. The one that was really interesting was visiting a fishing co-op and learning about all the challenges of the fishery and all the things that they have to deal with. And when you think about, we know we work in a dangerous industry and lots of people get hurt in farm accidents, but thinking about the idea of going out in a small boat many hours from shore in really not ideal situations. We did a whale watching trip the one day, and the ocean was super calm. And even then, I don't really enjoy being out. It was fun. Don't get me wrong. We didn't see any whales that day, but I was excited to be out there. But if there'd been much more of a wave than nothing, I would not feel super comfortable. I think I'm more of a land-based creature than a ocean-based creature. So anyway, it was really neat to learn more about the fisheries and the different types of work that they're doing out there on the ocean that is also feeding us. So that was cool. And we ate lots of seafood. So that's always a bonus for me as well.
It's always interesting to see how ag works in other places, because it seems so normal to us to do things the way we do it in our place and with our crops. And even, I will admit, we saw a field of sugar beets on the way to the tractor show, and I was really excited because I know we've had at least one guest on who grows sugar beets, and I found out that one of Jim's good friends combines primarily cotton, and that was kind of exciting because we've talked to a cotton farmer, and it's cool to get to hear about different things, because it's amazing how little we end up knowing about other crops and methods of production and what have you.
Yeah, exactly. It was really nice to be away. There were 2 buses full of us, so there was about 90 of us all together on the trip. So it was nice to meet some new people, both in Newfoundland and on the trip from our own province. And also a good reminder that we are, as much as we are land-based people, we are also not used to being around that many people all day, every day. So by the time we got home, I think we're both happy that we had gone and a little bit peopled out at the same time, but that's also okay. And the kids were here, and everyone seemed to have been surviving and thriving. The cows all got milked, chores got done, the grass was cut, the house was relatively clean. There was a bit of a stockpile of laundry, but we brought a whole bunch of dirty clothes home with us too, so I can't blame that all on the people who were here. And yeah, everyone seemed to have gotten along pretty well in their respective zones. So kids are all still talking to each other.
I was going to say, I can see you're in your normal recording space, so that implies that at least that much of your house is still standing.
Yeah, all reports were good. The only text I got from my mother-in-law while we were away was to let me know that everything was fine and they were getting along fine, just fine without us. So that was exactly the news I needed to hear midweek. So yeah, all was good back here as far as I can tell. And then on the return, just catch up stuff, lots of book work, housework, some cow stuff that needs to get finalized or, worked through that didn't get done while we were away. And cropping wise, it's a bit of a pause this week because it looks like it's going to rain for 4 days straight. And then it is our local fair on the weekend. So we'll be getting ready for that. So a few entries from some people in the house, plus our 4-H achievement day will be on the weekend as well. So all the stuff will need to get transported from here to there and then back home again, which is so much fun. But at least this one's close.
Yeah. The transporting of stuff is a very different situation once you have children than it is before. We were reminded of that this week as we were repacking the car.
Oh, yeah. This is not for the children. This is for the calves. Show supplies, right? Get them there, make them pretty, bring it all back home again. All right. So that's us for season 5. Thank you again for all of you for listening and supporting us. Like Katie mentioned, if you want to support us in a financial way, Patreon is a great way to do that. We continue to enjoy doing this show, but it's not free. And if you would like us to keep doing it, that would be a great way to help us out. And if you know of anyone who would like to advertise on the show, we are also open to having advertisers. So if you have a small business or know someone who does, who would like to get their product in the ears of other parenting families, you can let us know and we can talk to them. And as always, thank you so much to our editor, Krista, for the amazing work that she does. And we will introduce our guest for this week and also wish you a great summer, and we'll see you in September. Podcasts are free to listen to, but they aren't free to create. Katie and I would appreciate your support as we work to build the Barnyard Language community.
Patreon is an easy way for you to make a contribution that goes directly to making the show. As a member of our Patreon community, you get to watch the video version of our weekly updates, complete with questionable hairstyles and clutter. With 3 levels of support, you can choose a tier that works for you.
Keep the podcast going by becoming a patron today at patreon.com/barnyardlanguage. Today, we are excited to be talking to Anessa Good-Hassard, who is joining us from Alberta. And Anessa, we start each of our interviews with this very same question, and this is your intro to our listeners. So we're going to ask you, what are you growing? So usually our farmers are telling us about their crops and livestock, but you can also tell us about your business or personal growth or whatever else is happening around your place. So Anessa, what are you growing?
Oh, I love that. I like the broader, because I instantly went to, we're a cow-calf operation, and then we also grow hay. So that's our main 2 enterprises here. I also am growing my consulting business. I've went out on my own as an independent professional advisor now, and then just growing, really trying to put emphasis on relationships. And my husband and I have moved back. We're taking over my family farm and trying to really remember to slow down and just, enjoy the magic of being back on the farm, rural communities, and putting a lot of emphasis and time on that.
Farming and slowing down seem to be at opposite ends sometimes of what we're talking about. And I know that conversations around size and acreage are always kind of tricky, and geography matters so much. But just for context, what kind of scale are you guys working with when it comes to the animals and the hay?
Yeah, for sure. We're a smaller operation. So I grew up, we had purebred Simmental cattle, and we exported hay to Japan. That was the main operation there, but we have always had off-farm careers. So because we are a small operation, and then now that my husband and I have come back, I'm an only child. So when I was off doing my things and things like that, my parents downsized the farm, rented it out. And so we're just coming back in. So we're only up to about 50 head here so far, but have big plans for sure.
Sure. Before we go too much further into the rest of our conversation, why don't you tell us a little bit about your business? You said that you are an independent consultant, but what are you talking to people about?
absolutely. So I grew up, my father was the tax specialist for the province of Alberta here in Canada in agriculture. And so he had a big emphasis on obviously tax planning for farming families, and then really kind of chose to go into the lane of succession planning and helping families transition the farm to the next generation. He then retired early and went private consulting, and him and my mom started up, it was called GRS Consulting. And so I then joined their family, like the family business. So after I graduated university and spent some time, you grow up and you're never going to do what your parents do. Like that's just kind of, except for farming, that's there, of course, but career wise. And then I was like, wait, dad's got a really cool job working with families. We both have a passion of keeping the family in the family farm. So grew up or started to join their family business, and then transitioned to Farm Credit Canada, FCC, and was kind of on the building blocks of their team there, where we built out their transition program across Canada. So that was amazing, getting to, meet you, right? And travel across the country and see perspective outside of my prairie view historically. So that national perspective was amazing. And then, 2 years ago, I went out on my own as an independent succession planner with farm families. And so my goal is to help families start the process. And, really my goal is that they feel very empowered working with their technical professionals. So working with their accountants, their bankers, their financial planners, their lawyers, because the number one feedback I get is families say, well, I went to my accountant and they said, well, what do you want to do? And the family's like, well, what should I do? Like that's, and it's not your accountant's job or lawyer to tell you what to do. Like you have to come in with the preliminary bones of your plan. And I think historically, maybe that was what's caused some trouble in families, is that an advisor who doesn't know the inner workings of your family dynamics and your operation said, yeah, this is the lowest tax plan, or, this is the box that we've shoved you in. And then of course that's had consequences. So my goal is that they feel very empowered going to those technical professionals to help implement the best plan after.
That is a really good point, because so often it seems like, those are the people that you want to consult, but you're right. They don't know the personal side of your business necessarily. I mean, in small communities, sometimes they do, but they don't have those skills to navigate all of the complexities there. Whether it's finances or law, those are their specialties, and those aren't the only elements at play, especially when we're talking about families and businesses.
Mm-hmm. That's one of my first questions. How do you actually want to work together?
Yes, exactly.
Right. And you just see that kind of.
Yeah, that opens up a whole other conversation.
I'm going to interject here. Anessa, whether it makes sense to do it here or somewhere else too, can we talk a little bit about literally transitioning the relationships with our professional advisors as well? I know, especially with two generations involved, it can be hard to make that switch on who the agent's looking at when they're talking to someone, or, who the vet talks to when they come out. Those sort of things that, especially if it's someone like the older vet at our vet clinic has been working with my in-laws for, I don't know, probably 40 years now. But they're not actively involved in the management decisions of our livestock. And just those, it doesn't feel great to feel like you're stomping your foot and going, you're not the boss of me when the vet comes out, or you're talking to the USDA officer, whoever, or the bank, whoever you're talking to.
Yeah, there's so many layers to that question. So I love it. Thank you for bringing that up, Kate, because I think it's huge. I think, first of all, before getting into that dynamic shift of, who's in control, let's just name it to tame it, right? It's even just that huge relationship building. Like when I look at transition planning, I always say to my families, there's two eyeballs or two lenses. So lens one is our 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 year plan, like wherever you're at in your stage. But that second lens is what happens if any of the core farming owners and operators passed away tomorrow, because that's a critical piece, right? Not just for labor but for management, but for tacit knowledge, like that brain, right? What's all in our brain. So an exercise that I like to do with families is you just draw a 3-circle Venn diagram on a piece of paper, and everybody fills it out individually. And on one circle, it says family. The next circle, it says business. And the third circle says ownership. That's a very common model. It's called the 3-circle model of family business. And, that gets into who's invited to what meetings. It can be a tool there, right? Like if you're just in the family circle, you're not going to be a part of the business conversation necessarily. Oh, wait, does the succession plan have you inheriting assets and now you're an owner, right? Like it shows how we interlay there. But in this conversation, Kate, why I love this tool is I say everybody annually, twice a year, or, every 2 years, whatever, fills out who they think are trusted contacts in those 3 circles. So my family did this recently, and Dad had Bob in the business circle. And I was like, who the hell's Bob? Right? Like I had no idea. And Dad was like, well, Anessa, Bob's the guy I call when. So what's our family's next step? Well, I need to be introduced to Bob, build a relationship with Bob, but I also know in my back pocket, Bob's the guy I call if Dad was to pass away prematurely. He's a trusted contact. He knows our operation. And then that transition part is really powerful because Brett and I now have, my husband's name is Brett, trusted contacts or networking and relationships that we've built that Dad's like, well, who's Susie? Right? So it's showing that we're also, so I think that's a really, really powerful is building those relationships. That next layer of your question then comes on to saying, okay, have we been very clear and transparent with the advisor how we want this conversation or this meeting to look? Because there is a bit of, well, who's paying the fee? Like who's paying the bill? So if I'm getting paid by the parents, am I looking more at the parents, where their fiscal reality is, what this looks like? Or are we coming there being very open and transparent saying, we want this looked at as a family system, kind of the technical term, right? Operation. So there's pros and cons. I have some families that will, junior generation will have their own independent accountant. Senior generation will have their own accountant. Often, we hope that they're at the same firm at least so that we can make sure we're getting that whole picture view. There's consequences. I've had families miss out on massive childcare benefits because they didn't look at the system as a whole, right? So that's some ways I've seen it. There's also, I forget, there's a statistic out there. I'm not quoting it, but it's like 80 to 90% of family businesses change advisors when the next generation officially takes over because they feel like it's mom and dad's guy, right? So I think it's just going in very clear. I have lots of families that are doing that and just being very clear in how you want this approached. But that's on the advisor level. The seed rep that comes and, walks past me and still goes to Dad. There's no better training than Dad being like, talk to her. Like, I love that. I'm like, yes, right? Like you made a judgment error there, buddy. Yeah.
That's really interesting talking about who owns what part, because like our family farm is in an LLC. So my mother-in-law writes all the checks because that is her role in the LLC. But like our cattle belong to the LLC, but we brought them in as an asset. They are functionally our animals. So yeah, I mean, when I talk to the vet, my mother-in-law pays them, but I mean, she's had cattle her whole life, but she's not the one who's out here, when the vet shows up. And talking about making that transition to the next generation of advisors, if we're running into this, that like the lawyer my in-laws have worked with for the last 40 years is retiring because he's in his 70s. And, and so they're in that same place of transitioning from one generation of advisors to the next as well, as we're looking at.
And a lot of them have been bad at succession planning, right? Like themselves. Because I'm always like, okay, like who's your successor? Because they're great. And they're like, oh, I don't have anybody. Like, I'm just ready to go, have some time with my family and at the lake. And I'm like, okay, talk about tacit knowledge. Like that advisor, right?
And I think, you run into that. Well, I don't, they maybe don't want to leave that lawyer until they retire, but do you really want to run that out? Because you don't know that person's intentions either, right? And let's make that transition before they send you the letter that says, a month from now, my practice is closing, and you don't even have someone else to transfer all those files to, or that knowledge and that connection that you have with someone.
And I think the size, scale, and complexity of operations today, like I work with lots of families that they will outsource specific aspects of the transition, right? So for example, a corporate reorg, or, estate planning with children that aren't residents, here in Canada, that impacts rules, things like that. So I always encourage, because there's such a, like, we love our local professional advisor and things like that. But it's going that next step. Hey, size, scale, and complexity of today's operations. I am enjoying families that are saying, okay, we are willing to outsource this piece. The advisors are often more than saying, hey, this is beyond my level of scope. But then, of course, come on back for your annual.
Sure. Yeah. Or, your will is still there, but you're not taking your corporate legal stuff to the guy who's in town and, mostly does real estate transactions or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, we have to change that perspective. Even though we look at the family farm or the family ranch, it's so complex. And often a big part of my job is pulling out the family farm into buckets. That's what I always say.
Yeah, that's right. And as there are fewer farms, there are fewer lawyers who understand our industry too, right? So we have to go to they may not be local, but we have to go to the people who understand our businesses in a more complex way. So as a podcast for farming families, a lot of our listeners are similar to Katie and myself, who are sandwiched between, a parent generation and have kids growing up in our houses who may or may not farm, who knows. What are some of the ways that you have seen successful transitions from, say, the older generation to the middle, or what we're calling the kind of our generation? Obviously, each situation is different, but what are some of your, like ultimate success stories or models that you see that are really well done?
There's so many. Now I'm like, okay, how do I? And I love that that's your first kind of, big question into this, because I feel that a lot of times we talk about, fear-based, like, this shit show or this disaster. And I call them succession scars, because I think we all have them some way or another, and they're hidden. We can't see them, obviously, but I think every single family has elements of them. But I love that we're focusing on, like, what are people doing right? What are people doing well to start, right? So I think we have to step back and look at, I always just like kind of, we're so focused on micro all the time on our family and, what we see the neighbors doing, even though we have to remember that we're seeing such a small veil of what's happening. Like, I always will hear, well, the neighbors are doing it this way. And then, it's like a lender. You get to see behind the iron curtain and be like, yeah, they look like they're doing great, but if you saw their books, you'd be shocked, right? So I think that perspective is really important. But stepping back and saying, okay, reality is each generation is living 7 to 10 years longer, kind of the national statistic. So a blunt comment is that this sandwich generation didn't happen as much previously because people died. And so we have to now acknowledge that if we're living that much longer, then if we don't do proactive transitioning while alive, this sandwich generation is going to continue to increase. And so, some people, I think that's just it's kind of a common sense, but it just helps grant some grace, because I find people look at how they inherited the farm, or if they're a multi-generational, and it's such a pendulum. They either want to repeat pieces or aspects that went very well, and then they want to like throw it to the other side of the pendulum and say, I want to do things so differently than how it was done to me. But there's also unintentional consequences on this side too, right? So the families that do things really well, I'm a huge advocate for, transitioning while alive, obviously not waiting for the will to be read and finding out what's happening. But that's, balanced with, there's consequences of doing that too early. I've worked with some families that did everything right. They read all the articles, they transferred really early, and the cost of living and realities today, right? Like, grandma and grandpa are very tight on cash flow. So what child are they going to come back to? Are they going to come back to the off-farm kid, or are they going to come back to the farm kid and say, hey, we're really tight on cash flow? 9 times out of 10, they're going to come back to the farm kid, right? So I think that's a blend. Transferring while alive. I think obviously the families that are embracing that this is a journey and it's not a hard stop, and going from there. Oh, there's so many things. I'm like, where do we start? But I think the families are doing it really well. This will be a little bit of a soapbox, so I apologize, but I'm a huge promoter of, are we setting the next generation up for success? Because we spend so much time as parents and family and industry pressure of fair versus equal and tax planning and, the psychological, slowing down, retirement. But are we setting that next generation up so that they can actually run and manage this business? So I'd say that's my biggest factor, Arlene, because I sit with, if I'm sitting across from a 35-year-old, they can tell me their numbers, they understand the business, they know, they've sat in with the accountants and lawyers, tying back to our earlier conversation. And I'm sitting across from a 35-year-old, same exact farm on paper, same number of cattle, same number of acres, same equipment line. And they go, huh? To all my questions, which farm's going to survive? And I think we forget about that when we talk about succession planning. We talk so much about how best to control and protect equity and transfer the assets, that the critical piece is, are they going to be able to take this operation and grow it and thrive? So that's, I would say, the families that I see have the biggest success, put so much emphasis on having that successor really know how to manage, take risks, be allowed to make mistakes, right? Those are the families. It's a long-winded answer.
No, it was a really open-ended question. So, and like we said, every farm is different, and there's no one solution that works for everybody. But that's true. Having that generation who has been involved long enough to understand the business that they're in and be an effectual manager is a huge piece of that. Not just, okay, hand over the books on one day and be like, good luck, and not know what it is they're supposed to do from that point on.
Other things I would say, of course, is I think historically we've done a poor job of educating off-farm kids. I think that's a huge piece of, you don't know what you don't know. And then as the farm kids, we're often like judgmental or frustrated at the non-farming kids that have really good questions or fair concerns, I think often. And, a lot of it comes from a lack of education. Like, I was sitting with a family recently and I just did like the roughest cowboy math just on land, not taking into consideration multi-million-dollar equipment line, all these things. And I just, said to the off-farm kid, when you go to work, you need a vehicle and you need a backpack because your office supplies your laptop, right? Like, what capital do you have to put into your career? Meanwhile, mom and dad, it's taking them $67 of land capital to make $1 of grocery money. So it's that just perspective, right? I think is really important. And then I think ultimately the other families that I see survive, like my motto is your business plan and your estate plan have to always be talking to each other. So any change or diversification you make on the business plan, that has to be reflected in the estate plan. Because the biggest risk to me is that we open, mom and dad's will and it says farming child or successor has to, just a classic example, pay out siblings X millions of dollars.
Yeah. With what money? Yeah.
Yeah. I'd call it monopoly money, right? Like, I'm like, okay, let's go get out our board game and pull out the 300,000. It's monopoly money. But yet mom and dad have signed off on that expansion or diversification plan in the business today. So obviously our estate plan has to be updated, or I always say figure out at home first. Whatever that fair versus equal allocation has to be on the wealth side, then maybe that means we have to pass up that new barn or that new quarter of land or acre farm so that we're never caught in that can't afford both, because we don't know when we're going to pass away. So I call it an emergency will. I find a lot of parents, their shoulders just come down. I say, you're trying to write your will that's going to be read when you're 99. You're trying to anticipate marriages, markets, what enterprises we're running, grandbabies. Like, you're trying to just scenario plan for all these possible situations. If we write our will for the next 1 to 3 years and then know we can go and amend and change, you just see the shoulders come down, and finally parents will put pen to paper. Obviously, Kate, in the States, it's a little different. You guys have very different trusts, rules, and things like that than we do up here in Canada. But still, the methodology is the same.
Well, I know even it's interesting that you bring it up, because even for us writing our wills and we need to go update ours, we were advised to write them for like 5 years at a time, because we have young children, and what our goals are for having young children versus having, children who would be old enough to take over the farm is a very different situation. So speaking of having young children, how do we start bringing them into the idea that farming is a family thing when they're younger? Because as you're talking about, people living longer, we're also having kids at a later age. Like, I was 37 when my son was born. So it's not like my kids will be in their 20s and I'll be in my 40s. I'll be pushing 60 by the time they're well into their 20s. And that's certainly not, death's doorstep either, but it does really change that transition plan, and also I was talking to my husband about this the other day. 70 or 75 was a lot older when we were kids than it is now, and so you get more and more folks who are into their 80s who are still very active and, doing things, whether it's on the farm or, whatever else they're doing, that it's a very different, the ages that people are has changed a lot, I think, the expectation.
And it's such a double-sided coin. If Brett and I, like, he's a huge help because Brett and I have off-farm jobs, right? So he's putting around during the day doing great stuff. And if we were to just magically win the lottery tomorrow and quit our jobs and say, oh, Dad, we actually don't need you to get in and out of the tractor 15 times today, right? How fast would he decline?
Good luck.
And so, but that's where it's like that two-sided coin of like, I think maybe that's a little bit more the female side of me, but I've talked about that with my girlfriends and stuff. Like, we don't really want to see our parents slow down either, because they're so healthy, because they're so active. They don't have hobbies. Like, what, right? My dad does not have a single hobby. He hates anything off the farm. So then, you're like, okay, well, what are you going to do? You're going to sit in the house? Like, so it's such a catch-22 of, it's wonderful that they're still so active, but it is creating that bumper car effect down the line, right?
Well, and God love them, not to name any names, but we have an Australian Shepherd, and sometimes I feel like the effect of multiple generations can be kind of like any dog, where you need to find a job for them, or they will find a job themselves. And the chance of it being a job you want them doing is much better if you decide what that job is going to be.
Yeah, until you look out the window and you're like, oh my God, that happens all the time.
Not naming any names, but I've heard that this can be an issue for other people.
So absolutely. And then, tying back to young kids, I think, again, going back again to tying it back to our first conversation of, do you have, that legal support that understands the complexity? Because, everybody says, well, just have a will. Like, the worst thing you can do is not have a will. And I completely stand by that. I'm not contradicting that at all. Like, in Canada, especially, do not leave the government to tell you where your assets go. And the one that makes me sick to my stomach is, children. Like, that just horrifies me when they're not allocated, right? The important asset on any family farm is the family. So let's make sure we're putting that. But at the same time, a vague, basic, or cookie cutter city will that you've tried to fit a farm enterprise into can cause so much destruction also. So, that's where some families they're already saying, if I have 2 kids, 2+, like I'm already saying they're not going to inherit, land jointly. Like I'm already thinking about that, even though they're 2 and 4 years old. Like I'm putting it into an appropriate mechanism so that they will, have control or ownership at a, very commonly it's held in a type of trust until they're a certain age, right? That conversation has changed a lot just because the elephant in the room is the value of land. So, a lot of trusts used to say when they're an adult at 18, I have people now saying, if I'm not here, they're not going to have control and ownership of that multi-million-dollar asset until they're 30, right? Like, because again, that mentorship step isn't there. But yeah, even having that preliminary conversation of, we don't know yet who's gonna be the main successor. So we're creating opportunities with still the goal of keeping that operation viable, but recognizing we don't know who's going to step in yet.
When we're talking about financial viability, so often with farms, even if there are business structures in place, farm and personal finances can get mixed up and are hard to see, where the money is going and what is viable and what is maybe not, but is tradition. So we keep doing it. How do we and others, especially in an extended family situation, look at farm viability and finances in a way that makes sense and we can kind of visually see where we're going?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of, my question to the senior generation or whoever holds the equity at the start of working together is, are we transferring a viable and sustainable business? Because right away that impacts fair versus equal, right? And then what is their individual definitions of that question? Because that's a broad question. And then, well, yeah, we want the farm to survive. Okay, well, as we start to dig in, what's your definition of survive?
Is survival the bare minimum? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Is it that there's going to be off-farm income forever supplementing this? Is it going to be that it can only have one, sibling come home? Can it have multiple siblings? And then from there, that's kind of for me, to do the emergency estate planning. Then from there, we work as a family and say, okay, what do we want this to look like? Jumping around, right, Arlene? But like my husband and I are very passionate about like regenerative projects with the cattle on the cropland, right? Which historically was not done in this area as much. So, battling dad on that, of course, of, what traditional versus the new ideas. And so in that conversation, not going down the viability track as much, we'll circle back, but we've worked really hard as a family that starting to have the mentality that my parents are the in-house bankers on some, like a mindset shift, like the creditors, right? So the banker is never going to tell you what to grow or how to grow it, but they're going to expect a solid business plan. And so that is how, we're starting to have business conversations, not parent to child, but business partner to business partner conversations, going back and saying, here is our cost, here's the return on acres. Like, not just saying, oh, dad, we saw this thing on TikTok, right? It's like, no, there's actual numbers to it, and changing that dialogue. So I think that's a big part of junior generation coming home and having the passion and excitement. Like, you can't squash these new ideas, right? But then I also have a lot of junior generations that if they can't write a business plan and like, if they're not capable of doing that, that goes back to, well, how the hell are they going to run this operation, right? So starting off with that mentality. The business viability part, I'm super, super passionate about, because I think, again, under succession planning, it gets missed, right? Because we just think about how are we transferring, not necessarily, how are we growing and continuing, but then also still acknowledging our other children, right? However that looks. And an example of that, like my dad and I, when my husband and I moved back and started taking over the farm, like my dad's been a farm management specialist his entire career. And he was so frustrated at how little Brett and I knew, even though I took business, in university and separate courses. So I was like, well, as he's getting mad at me, I might as well be writing these things down, because we might as well make a course that other people can learn from. And one of those was, I always talk about shared language. So dad and I were really getting into it one night, going over our financial analysis and projections. And I realized we were talking about 2 completely different numbers, like just that quick. And so we've created this course, and module 1 is like, where did all our money go? Because that's the biggest thing, Arlene, right? Is I find families start to point fingers, right? Like dad is going to say, oh, it's the Amazon truck coming here, personal expenditures, right? My husband is going to say it's debt, and I'm going to say it's operating expenses, right? Like just that quick. And we start pointing fingers at the problem. And then what do? We start pointing fingers at each other, right? So, even we all know to manage on net, not gross. Like that's, but I take it one step further. And in this course, we break it down and say net income. You then have to take off your principal. So any principal payments you make, because net does not take that into account. Huge. Net also doesn't take into account your living, which is one of the biggest factors on a multi-generational family farm. The farm is your pension, right? So how are we making living out of that? And then it also doesn't take into account any cash down you paid. So for example, if you traded in a tractor and paid in a little cash on top of that trade-in value. And so when you take net income minus principal, minus living, minus cash down, we get to Anessa's word. This is not a proper terminology word, net income. And that is the number I think we need to be talking about when we're talking about viability and, scenario planning. And we break that down into a $1 analysis, which I think is really powerful, because when we get looking at the dollars and cents, and I find a lot of people will manage on their gross because they hear the big number, right? So for example, it'll say like, my gross income, $750,000. So, this unplanned expense of $20,000, it's not that big a deal. Let's put it on the credit card and get the points, right? Mixing those two. And, this $1 analysis can come back really quickly and say that actually could be up to 30% of your gross margin, like what's left over in the piggy bank. And so that $20,000, even though it sounds so small, that's actually a huge part of your risk. So I think that was a goal with the course we created, was to take really practical, not have spreadsheets and spreadsheets and spreadsheets, but also use your tax return as a management tool. I think a lot of people throw their tax return in the drawer, and it's an excellent tool to help assess where did our money go. 7 flags of operating loans. That's a big risk we're seeing up here. People living off their operating loans, not paying them off, right? Not tracking, should that expense have been paid off in 10 years properly, but because we use land equity, it's all part of the mismatch. So it's now taking us 25 years to pay off that sprayer. That's risk, right? There's lots of pieces to that. But I think income, I always say for viability, triage, first and foremost, mom and dad's income is secured now and until the day they die. I don't do any more planning. Before we start gifting equity, before we start transferring at less than fair market value, we have oodles and oodles of equity in agriculture, but we're so limited on income.
I think it's really important to have those conversations, like you said before too. If people are living longer, then it's great for the parents to be generous. But like you said, if 10 years down the line, someone is moving into a nursing home or retirement, needs extra care, and they now have no assets, and they're coming back to the farm family to say, all those assets we transferred to you, we actually need some of the equity out of those again, because we didn't plan far enough into the future for what our needs actually are going to be.
And it's a balance, because then you have parents that go, scarcity mindset, that's where all the psychological comes into, like my mom, like we talk about it, like she grew up with, very open, frank discussions about the Great Depression. So she's very cognizant of that, right? Not that she was alive in the Great Depression, but that was very open conversation in her family. And so again, it's that balance of, okay, like I know mom and dad are going to die owning some land. They're not going to die owning all the land, but everything else is a promise that I'll pay you back, right? And that's a lot of pressure on me. That's a lot of pressure on dynamics. And that again comes into that, like, you want to talk about people sitting down and having Christmas dinner together. Well, if we stereotypically go back to the farm kid that's taken on the debt, taken on the risk, taken on the work, why shouldn't there be some from my sister in Toronto, right? Like, why is that all coming back to me? So that gets into bigger questions of, why are non-farming kids inheriting land, for example, debt free when we're transferring all the risk and debt to the farming operation. I think that all has to be acquainted into fair versus equal planning.
One of the things that can be an issue as well, and like for our family, our farm is held in an LLC, which is owned between the 4 adults. So not my husband's sister, but my in-laws, my husband, and myself. For example, our house is part of the LLC. But then we have my in-laws' house is also on the property. We share a well. Our electric bill for our house is shared with the farm because there's only 1 meter, and adding a second meter is like $50 bajillion or something stupid. And we don't, because we're not raising hogs, we're not milking, we don't use enough electricity on the farm for it to be worth adding that second meter to really be able to split it out. So how do we record and communicate those things? And it's so strange to, when it does come up in conversation to talk about, the emotion of the fact that we won't pick a house. Maybe when the kids are old enough to take over, we will, but like, this is the farmhouse. It comes with the farm. Here's where you live.
Yeah. And I can tell you to paint your cupboards blue. Really? Right? Like it's not autonomy.
Anessa, my kitchen cabinets are bright blue. I don't know if you saw them somewhere, but I painted them like the week I moved in, and it was a real...
You were allowed to paint them?
I didn't ask.
Oh, there you go. Ask for forgiveness after.
Yeah, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. Absolutely. But things like we don't have a mortgage because housing is part of our compensation for our work. But then to outsiders, it can sound like, oh, you're just being given this, where we're not. We don't get paid for our work. We get a house, which is a very different thing.
And a house with restrictions and rules, and yeah.
And a house that's 121 years old. And we have put a lot of money into, which we're very lucky to have. Like, don't get me wrong, but a 120-year-old house comes with a lot of restrictions just based on what it is.
Yeah, 100%. I am very short, but I didn't know if you could tell from this, like, how small this room is, because we are also in the over 100-year-old farmhouse on the farm as well. So yeah, it's compensation is such a complicated and complex discussion. And again, I spend a lot of time on it because I think it just kind of gets swept under the rug because we're focusing on the big shiny asset transfers, right? And things like that. But I think a big part of compensation is that's the stuff that will grind at you day to day. Like, that's the day to day. It's where resentment really starts, I think. And I think a big hurdle is when we start to feel that resentment, we start to tie our value or our worth to our compensation. And we all know in agriculture, we can't, right? We can't do that because we're never going to be compensated for our worth. So I have a free compensation download on my website that it's like a case study. And I think it helps because it goes through, and that's one of my first things, right? Is how are you compensated? And even that question will kind of throw people because they'll be like, well, I don't know. My accountant pays me X amount of dividends, right, from the LLC, X amount of wage, and then I sell stuff on the farm stand and don't claim that, right? Like, just that kind of, there's always that workaround. And so, it's first starting off and just saying, there's wages or salary, which is compensation for work or labor done. So we will never be paid equal to our work or our labor. But then I think it's really important to go that next step and say, okay, what about management fees? And again, that's starting to change the mindset from hired hand to, no, I'm taking on some ownership and some responsibility and some care that I am managing an area. And I think that's really important in transition because we can't transfer management all at once. So this is where I'll have, junior generation say, okay, I am ready. I worked my way. I'm going to now be manager of marketing. So, I'm going to have ideas of what I want to sell the grain at and the contract, but I'm still going to run it by dad or mom or whatever. But what I like about that is it just really starts to change that mindset, that's almost more of a salary mindset, right? Where, in jobs previously, I did a ton of overtime that I did not get paid for because I was salary. And that's a mentality shift as well. I know my dad would rather have a hired man than me any day, because the hired hand isn't going to ask why, right? And he's not going to challenge that all the time. So dad jokes about that all the time too, but I'm like, you're making me, I'm going to be able to run this thing because I am asking.
I'm after your job, Dad.
Yeah. Return on investment is the next one. So if you are incorporated, that would be like a dividend. If you're not incorporated, it's not very common, but it's still that mindset of like, that could be an interest on like your equipment value, right? Just that mindset piece. The next one is redemption of equity. So again, I think this is really important in agriculture because we have so much equity and we have to start figuring out how do we live off that equity. So again, if you're incorporated, this could be examples of the corporation buying back shares. So not an individual, but the corporation, and we redeem those shares out to senior generation. Often as that redemption strategy is occurring, it's a teeter-totter effect, and the common shares or the growth share is allocating to the junior generation. So it's like a win-win there, or shareholder loans. And then rent on personally owned land also. So we've got to really watch that and work with our accountants on how best to achieve that. But, if people have personally owned land, those are strategies there. So I'm not saying your accountant is going to break it out line item by line item. They're going to often have, the best way. But if we as a family have an internal understanding, that's again taking it away from the hourly mindset. So then that plays into family dynamics, and this case study works through it. I'll just go really fast. I had a dad and son come into my meeting, and they weren't talking to each other because all about compensation. The dad thought his son was an entitled fill in the blank because he was getting paid more than he ever took out of the farm, right? The son was so frustrated that he was doing all this work and he felt couldn't afford groceries, right? Kind of that. So I've had the last 3 families I worked with. One of the homework assignments has been dad has to go and do the weekly grocery shopping. Because that's reality check-in number 1, right? And the one dad came back and he's like, for just me and mom, I spent what we used to have when I had 4 boys at home. And I'm like, okay, so your son, reality check number 1. Where's cost of living, right? Can this farm afford it? But with this case study example, I went back and said, okay, son, are you comfortable that dad is doing 3 times the management decisions that you are today? Like just pulling it out of the sky. But from what they told me, and the son said, yeah, I am. I said, Dad, are you comfortable that son is doing 4 times the amount of labor that you're doing? And that's like there's a big mental check there to admit, right? That transition had happened and son was doing 4 times. And of course the dad sat there and, you could hear the clock ticking for a little bit. And then he said, yeah, I am. What do you think that son's jaw did? Hit the floor, right? So, because dad was actually recognizing and appreciating. I think in a business, we talk about return on assets. In a family business, I talk a lot about recognition and appreciation, right? Tying into that worth piece. Anyway, we worked down with this family. Mom and dad were being compensated because they had personal land going back to the court. Mom and dad also were doing that redemption strategy, which is an excellent strategy. So yes, dad was taking out $20,000 more than junior generation in this example, but junior generation hadn't sat in on any of the accounting meetings, had no idea how any of this worked. And within 10 minutes, had I solved all their problems? Absolutely not. But they were talking to each other because they both felt valued, respected for the effort they put in, right? So I think that's a huge piece of it. And then also to that perks conversation, Kate, that's what I call it. It's just perks, cash equivalents, right? So my dad created a formula that I use a lot, and it says value equals cash plus perks plus equity. And so it's saying, okay, cash is whatever you're paid in wages or salary. Perks is, I think, a really important conversation to have on farm families that we don't have enough. So, for example, when I quit my job in downtown oil and gas in Calgary and moved back to the family farm to join mom and dad's consulting business, what they told me they could pay me, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be eating itchy band until I die. Like, that's it, right? And so, but my dad sat down with me and said, let's talk about the perks you're getting. You're paying less rent than what the house should be. And we went down and did like a pretty extensive and we mashed it with, I'm not paying for horse hay, I'm not paying yardage. Like we combined the two, right? And when we added it up, I was making double what I was making downtown oil and gas. But of course it wasn't reflected in my checking account, right? So I think that conversation is really important because it's not a finger pointing conversation, but it's recognition for farm generation when we're like, how are we going to pay for our groceries, right? And then the beauty of a multi-generational operation is that as Brett and I take over and mom and dad continue to stay on the farm, I think that's their goal for as long as health allows, we'll be taking over the utility payments, we'll be taking over all of those payments and have to be responsible to make that work. And that's the beauty of that transition, I think, is that it's never a finger pointy because it's going to go both ways.
It's another gross versus net conversation, right? In terms of your actual income and what that looks like at the end of the month, at the end of the year.
And this is when I'm an advocate for off-farm kids to have, some, I think, fair questions. We have to get a lot of perks in agriculture. So some families with that formula, they will not count perks as part of the compensation, but it's still an important conversation to have annually as a check-in. And I'm fine if you don't want to count it. And then, of course, the point of that value formula is it's above and beyond a hired hand. So it's saying, hey, you might be worth $120,000 because you're coming up with new ideas. You're doing all this research. You're doing all these things. We can only afford to pay you 60, picking a number, right? And then, of course, that equity number on the back is basically trying to put a number to sweat equity to track. And then there's, of course, clear expectations. How are we converting that into equity in the future? But it's trying to say, hey, I want to recognize and appreciate that you are worth a lot more than we can afford to pay you. But in off-farm kids' defense in this conversation, I think we have to be careful in agriculture that we, every family's different, but lots of families I'm sitting down, it's significant perks. Like it's vehicles, it's cell phones, it's, all of this is running through some of the farm corporations and things like that. And so I was sitting in with a lender one time in a joint meeting, and I had so much respect for the lender because each family member, daughter, son, and mom and dad were all pulling out $70,000 a year to live out of this farm corp, which was $280,000, right? It was a hard hit with where they had been just with the drought. And the lender threw his book down and stood up and said, I have to make my mortgage payment, my car payment, put both kids in hockey, and I barely make more than that. You're getting all of these perks plus. And so I think that's an important recognition that whether you choose to allocate it or not, if nothing else, it's recognition and appreciation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because as, the gas price goes up, I recognize the fact that I don't pay that much attention to it because I just pull over to the gas tank that's in the yard, or, the electricity bill, ours is the same. The barn and the house are on the same meter. And so it's covered. And so, it's not nothing. And we have to acknowledge that, what we have left at the end of the month is not the same as someone who is paying all of that out of the salary that comes in.
Yeah. But give and take, because then exactly like Kate and I were joking about, right? It's not we have to have a forgiveness meeting about painting cupboards, right? I wasn't even allowed to paint the cupboards the first time I moved back. Mom was like, no, we're leaving them this because I know you're going to move out and this will be fine for renters. And I was like, sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure if my grandmother-in-law was going to speak to us after we renovated the farmhouse, but she came around to it.
Anessa, the response I got was my mother-in-law came in and she goes, it's very colorful in here. And I was like, well.
Yep, you're right.
Okay. You are not wrong. I'm really enjoying too this talking about perks versus cash outlay, because I think also it can be the reverse. American agriculture pays substantially differently than Canadian agriculture in a lot of ways, is something that we are finding out increasingly every day. And it can be easy to say, well, you have all these perks, but at the same time, and I mean, those perks are amazing. Ford Auto Credit will not take that in lieu of payment on my car payment. Like that is still a conversation that you have to be able to identify both of those values of cash flow plus perks. And I think it can be tempting to ignore actual cash flow in favor of perks. And maybe it doesn't matter that much what your cash flow is, or maybe you're choosing to make that decision, but you have to know what you're choosing before you can choose it.
That's the underlining. And Arlene, to tie back to your, kind of like personal on there too, for family farms, you say, what are success stories? Kind of my language is they're creating an off-farm wealth bubble. So families that are doing very, very well it's very hard because of agriculture economics. So I'm, 90% of my clients have put every single dollar back into the farm. And I understand and I respect that. But I think for learning for the next generation is that if you can create any type of off-farm wealth bubble, it doesn't have to be $1 million investment portfolio, $200,000, like whatever it can be. That's the flexibility that allows so much in transition planning. And so, again, how are we compensated? The temptation to leave every dollar back in the farm as retained earnings to grow or expand. Once again, that's long-term thinking on one side of the coin, but it's short-term thinking on the other side of the coin when it comes, once again, to income, perks, setting that successor up for success. Do they know how to manage their money? Right? Like I'm frustrated when I sit and they're like, well, they have a company truck and the company cell phone's paid for, and, they are paid beyond little, like, just grocery money because they still live in the basement. So maybe they're not even paid that. They're paid fund money, right? And I'm like, what mentality are you creating here? Like, liability, right? Do I want a 17-year-old driving around in the company truck, or do I want a 17-year-old, right? Yes, he's going to pay a little more in insurance, but maybe he's got to, learn how to manage that. And so, because now it's a complete shift. I never used to spend as much time as I do now on personal credit card debt. But if you've never learned how to manage your personal side,
right, if you didn't have to make those truck payments or pay your own insurance, or
you never have made a credit card payment, right? Like, yeah, 100%. And then the next step is when that next generation, even if they're wonderful with their money, when they go to take advantage of young farmer products or loans or lending opportunities, the bank's going to come back and say, you have no history here. So then we see these reactive transition plans where mom and dad will just throw the kid, 15% of the shares in the company or something like that. And
right. So they've got something to borrow against. Yeah.
And I just think, I really like setting it up so they learn how to manage a bit on their own side. I always say if they can manage their little mini farm, depending on how the operation's structured, of course, like a dairy, for example, that's hard. But, getting to actually have to sit there and get their own operating line and go through and learn how to manage on a small scale. Those are the managers that are miles and miles above versus just being thrown in that reactive 10% into the corp as common shares. And then we didn't do anything for another 15 years. Everything's a circle in succession planning.
Yes. Yeah. So on that note, when we talk about talking about succession early and involving our kids, how do we do that without putting pressure or expectations on kids who might not actually be ready to make that decision, whether they're going to commit to the farm long term or if that is the career path that they actually want to take or feel like they have to take?
Yeah, I love again, I love that line of questioning, because usually it's just under the assumption, like I just find as an industry, we're like, well, we have to be open and we have to be transparent. We have to communicate more and we have to communicate better. Like, well, if it was that easy, right? It's convoluted, I think, again, because a lot of these financial realities, right? Which I think, again, get overlooked as just, well, you need to communicate more. And it's like, well, our fiscal reality is saying it's a big push and pull, right? And I think that's a reality piece, again, of, I'm very much an advocate for transparency of concepts, but not necessarily, depending on age and stage. There's some super mature 18-year-olds, right? And then there's some like 26-year-olds that you're like, ooh, right? Like that's why I always say stage, not age necessarily, but being very transparent of concepts. So that's where I think, it goes through and says, okay, yes, it takes $1 to run this operation. That's that $1 analysis. 55 cents of that goes just to operating expenses off the top, right? 20 cents of that goes to overhead. So like you start to see, because otherwise we can even get caught in it. We see the shiny paint, right? We see, cow-calf operations. For the first time in my career, the question is coming up, well, if mom and dad die tomorrow, who gets the cows? That was never a question.
Because now they're an asset instead of a liability.
Yeah, 100%. So, we laugh about it, but it's also this like, okay, right?
Yeah, it's not just the land has value anymore.
Mm-hmm. And so bringing junior generation in early, I think, again, that's where I'm really big on transparency of concepts. And then, again, not pressuring them. Yes. I love when they have went and worked for somebody else. That's always a huge benefit, because you come back and, you realize, oh, dad's not that hard on me, right? Or the opposite. I've had the opposite where they come back and then I'm like, okay, well, is this what you want for your life? Like, if you're miserable here, is this what, is this what you want for your life? The other side of that, though, is what I find, probably because I'm in a silo of working with family farms, contradictory to the statistics or the numbers I have, where multiple siblings all want to come home. Like, it's not figuring out who has the passion. It's like, well, they all have the passion, right? So setting that, again, up early is, if there's an age gap, right? Like, I've had parents that have said, everybody has to make a decision by 25, just picking a number, right? Because what I saw here in Alberta in 2015 when oil crashed, and then I saw it again in COVID, is you just had people kind of come out of the woodworks and knock on the door and say, hey, I want to be part of the farm. And so, if I'm the successor that's been there in the last 10 years, I'm like, okay, well, that's coming out of mom and dad's equity, not what I've earned, and again, can they work together?
And a farm that could sustain a farm that could sustain maybe one or two people home full time can't maybe sustain 3 families, in the same way. So then you're going to have to look differently at what the work and the equity looks like.
Which is then a question that I often get glares at when I ask it. But, mom and dad, do you own the equity you think you own? Because how much of that equity, would you have purchased that land if your successor hadn't come home, right? Would you have taken on that many more cows because of the labor and everything else? Like, so the term I use is heritage equity. Like, you tell me as a family, when did that clock start? Was it the day they all moved out at 18? Nobody worked harder than the other, right? Or if the farm kid that had more passion was out there doing chores before school and the off-farm kid wasn't, like, is that being tracked, right? But where's that heritage equity piece? And then, of course, from there, that growth. And again, mom and dad have to lead that dance, but that again comes back into if somebody comes and knocks on the door for fair versus equal, how much of that growth should already be allocated to the successor that's been home. That comes into the 60s. One of the 60s, of course, is of risk management is divorce. And so that's, kind of one avenue when we talk about prenups and postnups, again, is, if the marriage hasn't purchased the asset, should the marriage own it? That can help that heritage equity conversation. Versus, of course, if you go out and purchase a new piece or you use that heritage equity piece as borrowing security against that new piece, maybe that is divisible, right? We got to take the family farm and put stuff into buckets. Otherwise, if it's like this, we can't see the forest through the trees.
Well, and I think, too, you end up with issues with age gaps in children. My kids are 16 months apart, so they're pretty evenly matched in these things. But, like, we have friends who are almost 15 years apart. And that has created some real issues about who came home when and who worked when, and this isn't fair to this one and this isn't fair to the other one, and it can really just bring up a lot of shit. So as an only child, I think that only having one kid is probably the way to go. Because Anessa, I know you said you're also an only child. I think that's probably the way to.
My dad joked that they also had me late, and he joked that he had done too much of this for his career. So he was like, that's it. Just having one. But there's a lot of, I always say, okay, like everything is on me, right? Like all of their care, all of their support, all of their, like, there's pros and cons to both models. But yeah, that age gap is a real thing. Again, that's why, sometimes I have parents say, like, even if Johnny is 15 years younger, he still gets to 25 to have an opportunity to come back, right? But if I've already been there 15 years, how much of that growth, again, that's why I say, does that come back out of parents' equity, right? That heritage bubble. And, you're probably not going to be at that same level as the brother that's 15 years older, but, that 15-year older brother is sure going to let me know how spoiled and babied that younger one is and had perks and stuff too, right? So you can go around and around, but at some point you've just got to, explain your why, but you've got to put some lines in the sand.
Anessa, one thing we did in our farm planning as well is we talked about who should have essentially first right of refusal on taking over the farm if neither of our kids wanted it. And that was a really good and important conversation to have, because all four of us came back with the same name independently, and it's not a family member. But knowing that we all agreed on who should have that right, because our farm has been sold rather than inherited generation to generation. We're buying it through the LLC, so there's no cash exchange, but there's also it really reduces that, well, I'm family, entitlement that can happen, I think. And it feels a lot easier to think about if you know who you would like to have the first crack at it, whether it's a kid or whether it's another person, to name that name. And for us also to really prioritize, that to us keeping our family together was more important than keeping the farm active, and that keeping the farm in the family was also more important than keeping us running the farm, if you had to make a choice. And that was really helpful for us.
Yeah, that's another core question that I think, Kate, needs to be highlighted. What you just mentioned is, I will say, like, yes, the goal is that we all get together at Christmas and this farm's transitioned. But, I have families, and that's absolutely fine. They are entrepreneurial, business focused. They're like, hey, I don't love my sister anyway. So the goal is, that this operation continues over family. Versus I have other people that will say, all we care about is that everybody, sits together at Christmas, and then maybe the business viability is going to be impacted to achieve that goal. And I have no issue with that. I just need that's a transparent concept so that I know as the successor, right? Am I investing into this long-term vision knowing that I'm going to have off-farm income for the rest of my life, or I'm going to have to, this land is going to be lost, or ownership is, I'm going to have to ask my sister, depending on how the share structure is orientated, like, am I going to have to check in with her how much phosphorus I'm putting down? I'm not willing to do that, right? So that's a key question that I also ask, just to get people kind of in the arena I need them in. Is it transferring family dynamics? Is it transferring a viable business? And obviously everybody comes back to, we want both. but the decisions you're going to make, you're going to be making decisions on either side of those.
Well, and that's something that came up for me when you were talking about, looking at how the neighbors are doing X, Y, and Z is, I know more than a few families where they may sit together at church, they may be putting out that impression of happy families, but any peek behind the curtain on that makes it real clear that it is maybe doing what they're doing is not the best way to do things, and that what is presented as what they're doing might not accurately reflect the lived experience around that, around that dining room table at meetings.
And it's so hard. And I think, again, that's where we have to grant ourselves and our family, and our industry as a whole, like, yeah, we can't take our foot off the brakes, but we also, gas, pardon me, but we still have to remember, like, this is hard because there's so much identity, there's so much legacy, there's so much pride, there's so much heritage, but then there's also, I continue to come back to wealth versus income. There is not another industry that has the discrepancy in wealth versus income. So yes, our net worth statements look ginormous, but we all know the income side of that. So it's like when, I've taken training because I think it's important to get out of our silo in family businesses that are not agriculture. And I mean, they can just set so much stuff up with share allocation and, all of this. And because there's cash, right? It's tight here. But again, we have to remember, I always challenge, we never talk about the fair market value of our operation unless what? Like, what are the 2 times we talk about it? We talk about it when we're creating a net worth statement to go to the bank to get lending. And for some reason, it's a culture thing that I want to shift. We talk about it when we start to talk about estate planning and, fair versus equal. And I always say, okay, are we using fair market value? Because whose definition is fair market value? That's an ambiguous number. Are we talking about appraised value? So at least we have like some formality to it. Or are we talking about productive value? Like, what are we actually, because that's the number that you and I have to farm off of. So I think that's a huge shift, again, ties back to educating the off-farm child, but, just using pretend numbers here. Yeah, you're inheriting a $1.25 million quarter, which is very low in lots of areas and very high in other areas, right? But yeah, you're getting your $14,000 rent check. You're getting a $6,000 rent check if we're running cows on it. And so then, we judge the off-farm kids for saying, well, that's so much wealth, or if I liquidate that. So it's really, this mindset shift that it's patient capital. Again, you guys have opportunities in the trusts that we don't have here in Canada to really say this land is not going to be flipped as fast, right? But again, I can empathize with parents that say, how do I sleep at night knowing that if the farm successor ever gets out of farming, it's going to be multi-million-dollar wealth that we talk about in movies. Like, each grandkid's going to have a trust fund, and each, meanwhile, my kids off farm don't have the standard of living. My dad jokes about in the 80s, grandpa sold the farm to him because he was the child my grandpa loved the least. Like, that's the joke, right? Meanwhile, now it's flipped, that farming, yes, it's of course still a very capital intensive business, but the quality of life of farming children compared to 9-to-5 office job and can't afford rent in lots of the major cities, that conversation is difficult.
I think, though, those hypothetical situations, right, and sometimes they do come true, like some people are going to sell the farm, but often that is because of that viability piece, right? I mean, yes, you're selling it for a lot of money, but then how much debt are they paying out, right? Like, what is their, what does it actually turn into at the end? And yes, there's still cash there, but the success or the the parents or grandparents can't control the farm from the grave. So, what happens down the line, to a certain degree, you kind of have to let go of that control, and the people who are farming can't farm for their ancestors. They have to farm for themselves and for their descendants, and do what they can with what they have and do the best that they can or know how to do. So there's only so much control that you can have once those assets have been passed on.
Yeah. And I think that's where, proactive planning, there's lots of mechanisms we can put in place, right? There's lots of structure. Like, that's our job, is to come up with some solutions to these questions, right?
Yeah. And if there's some kind of a legal agreement to say, if you sell, the off-farm siblings get a share of that, because maybe not the same amount, right? You're not dividing that up between the 3 of you or the 4 of you, but if that was a parent's asset and that was their main asset and that was what they passed on, then yeah, there should be some mechanism in place to share that with off-farm siblings to a certain degree.
Exactly. And that was just going to be my, advocacy for having your professionals, right? Like, not sitting at home. Like, that's what I find is people just spin on these scenarios, and it's like, hey, actually we can cover a lot of these fears, right? Like, there is structures in place and things like that.
And hope that it doesn't happen. But if you've planned for that eventuality and it does or doesn't happen, then you've already taken care of it and you can worry about something else. When we talk about having plans, it's great to have a conversation with someone and be like, yes, that's what we're going to do. But where sometimes it falls apart is the actual steps of putting that plan into action and then doing those regular follow-ups that you need to do. So how do we keep ourselves accountable to ourselves? Because a lot of us are self-employed.
Yeah, 100%. It's so much easier. Like, that's what I do with some families, right? Is like help, stay on. And then I always laugh that in my own family, right? Like, the wheels fall off or whatever, because it's so much easier when it's not your family, right? Because there's just so many layers there. But I think, that's really, again, what's the why? Like, if we're doing it because we feel that, well, they're just putting this plan in place because they think I'm going to die, right? That's a whole other. So my goal, even on that control conversation, is, when my dad was doing consulting, the reason I chose to do this at my young age, I'm not as young anymore, was I was so frustrated sitting in the crowds, and like, everybody had gray hair and they were talking to the people with gray hair in the room. And I was like, any decision you make between you little gray haired room that I'm not invited in is going to drastically impact me and my future and my family. So I need a voice at the table. So I think, I hate the word control because I don't want to be controlled, but I will buy in to protect all day long. So just that mindset shift, right? Of, I haven't met a family yet that says, how can we protect mom and dad? Because they have built this, they have carried it, right? Again, going back to that income piece, how do we protect our family, off farm, everything along there? And then, of course, how do we protect our land, our equity, our genetics, our heritage, right? And it's just such a completely different mindset shift. Like, you just feel the energy in the room change. And then it's easier to have those check-ins because you're saying, okay, is there any area here that we're not addressing that's putting this goal of protecting these things at risk? So I focus a lot on the 6 Ds. It's not a perfect, but I think it's an umbrella. And I always say, okay, to protect those objectives, what happens? This is a big part of proactively transitioning. So trying to transfer equity while alive. These are the big hurdles that I find people balk at it. So of course, A is divorce, right? And I say, okay, what risk mitigation strategies can we put in place here so that is mitigated? It's never 100%, but it's mitigated. And again, what are we doing that's a family goal? Because some of my favorite families I worked with, again, when you go back to what are successful stories, is, if mom and dad got divorced, this operation's done. If junior generation gets divorced 2, 3, 5 years into their marriage, how much equity do they own? What's at risk, right? So then I'll have families come back and say, okay, mom and dad are actually going to sign a domestic contract or a prenup, or there'd be a postnup for them, of course, if they're married, that says, okay, this is how it's going to be allocated, because it's not put on the new daughter-in-law or son-in-law. It's going to be a family policy, right? So I love, and they always say to me, Anessa, you think I would have divorced him by now? Like, I would have done it by now. And I'm like, yeah, of course. It's just a consideration. And again, my goal with these 60s is if we're proactive, my hope is that it doesn't feel as personal. When we wait to react to a situation or what someone said or, things like that, now it feels very personal, which just blows up. So, one family I worked with, the first farming son got married. There was no discussion of a prenup or anything like that. And then just a year later, the farming daughter got married and everybody in the family wanted a prenup. And I was like, well, how do we think Christmas dinner is going, right? So if we're proactive, so, I'll work with families that I always say before they find their person, is this an expectation or not, right? And then, of course, it's not screw the spouse. That's the old mentality. It's how do we protect the in-law, because they have to have independent legal advice, right? How do we protect them, but also how do we protect the business? Next D is disposition, which is just a fancy word for sell. So exactly what you talked about, Kate. If we can proactively talk about, somebody is going to want out at some point, right? Convert their wealth to income. So whether it's, the farm isn't viable anymore because we've lost a lot of rented land, or, there's somebody gets hurt, or, what does that look like? How fast can the owner be bought out to not jeopardize the business? That's the big question there. Or in Kate's example, who do we want to offer first right to, right? Next D is debt. So of course, right, that's where we start to ask questions like, if I inherit land, it's the unspoken expectations that come with it. So one of my early quotes is, unspoken expectations are the silent killers of family farms and ranches. So my goal is that we're articulating. So if I inherit a quarter of land and I go and put a loan against it the next day, I've had so many parents come back and be pissed that their kid borrowed against this heritage equity. And I'm like, well, you transferred it with no strings attached and no conversation. So, let's have these proactive conversations. Of course, there's a whole slew of things to debt, but that's a big D. Death is a big one. So like I talked about, I think we tend to focus a lot on what happens if the senior generation passes away, but I think it's equally as critical to talk about what happens if the successor passes away. How are we protecting that in-law, right? Like in your case, Kate, right? If the house is owned by the corp and everything like that, how are we still ensuring, if that's the family's wish, that there's an opportunity for those like grandkid levels to still be involved?
That was honestly a huge thing for us because our kids we did our first will before we even had children, updated it when the kids were like toddlers, and talking about things like, do I still have the right to live in the house if something happens to my husband? And, our kids are set to inherit his shares, but at the time I was not a shareholder. And do I suddenly become homeless when my kids turn 18 and they're like, ha, bye, mom, which seems to be the route they're on anyway, but I'm raising them, so whatever, that's my own fault, but all of these complications and things that once you talk through them, you don't have to think about them again for a while, which is nice.
It's a huge peace of mind, right? And I think just going that next step, like, there's a lot of corporate insurance that will say, if two siblings are in a company together, if sibling A passes away, they have corporate insurance so that in-law spouse is supported, right? Financially, which is huge because obviously, but the consequence of that is I'll say, okay, well then, brother or sister B now owns 100% of the company. Like, was that the intention? You've now completely removed that opportunity from that grandchild generation. So I think that's just the greatest thing we can do. I just get on a whiteboard and just follow the assets, right? Like I'll put one quarter of land at a time, corporate shares, preferred shares, common shares, and you just kind of work your way down. Where does that go? And then again, I always say, name it to tame it. So once you kind of have this rough idea and you've updated your will, in that draft phase, that's when our accountant needs to come in, and that's that multidisciplinary advisory approach, and needs to come in and say, oh, are you aware, in Canada, that, you have a lot of equity transferring from an aunt or an uncle to a niece and a nephew, and you're not eligible for the rollover rules, which are Canadian tax rules, so there's going to be a significant tax burden there. I want to name it and have a cowboy math number of what that tax consequence is going to be. I want to know who's paying it, how are we paying it, so that there's not these, and sometimes families will come back and say, oh, we're going to actually mold our plan a little differently because tax is critical. So that's where it's so important to have that multidisciplinary advisory approach before we cement the plan.
But also, like you said earlier, not just use tax avoidance as your only planning mechanism too, though, because that just to avoid taxes doesn't always lead to the best plans.
Mm-hmm. And then the next D, I kind of loop all of these, is just dementia, disease, disability, right? So what happens when we are mentally or physically not our true self? The dementia one really scares me just because I've seen some really, really hard, and they're just such heartbreaking cases. One family, they went outside and there's liners lined up and the whole herd had been sold out with no communication or discussion, and decades of genetics and things like that. And of course, after that decision was made, got tested, and right. So we don't make, obviously, sometimes the most rational decisions. So having, in your operating agreements or things like that, confirming with your lawyer how to properly word those. But, in Alberta here, it's personal directive, like, who steps in and makes decisions for you when you are no longer of cognitive ability. That's for like will planning, or health decisions. But, what do we have in real time if you still own the majority of the shares, or, things like that. I never used to talk a lot about disease and disability, but that's just such a huge one, again, because of the size and scale of operations. So, is there different types of insurance? What's our contingency plan? The neighbors will pull your crop off for one harvest, but, what happens if your leg's broken or something like that? And then the last one's disagreement. Everybody talks about taxes and death and things like that, but I like to add on disagreement too, because we're family. I think it's a given. We're going to disagree. We have people of all different perceptions and personalities. And so again, this proactive work is that hopefully by having things in writing, checking in and going through with a little bit more formalization, it's the size, scale, and complexity of our operations that it's counterintuitive. Everybody says, well, Anessa, I trust my family members, right? And I say, if you trust them and you love them, I think that's, the utmost important to have these documentations. And not everything has to be so formal. I think that's, again, this kind of weird thing that I see is people say like, well, I'm not going to pay a lawyer to put that, down in writing. And I'm like, you can have memorandums of understanding. They are not going to stand up in court. Like, that's critical. They can be challenged, all of these things. But, even in our own family, just last night, Dad was like, we were talking about the upcoming crop cycle, and I was like, yeah, we're paying you half cash rent on that land, and then we're not. And Dad's like, no, like, we're letting you use that land for free, and we're charging you half cash rent on this land. And, instead of me and him having a moment of tension, I just pulled it up because we keep stuff in a Google Doc, and I was like, oh, you're right. Just those simple, we have so much going on every single day that I think the power of writing things down is truly a gift.
Yeah. We all need to take minutes. We're getting to the age where you can't remember it all, for sure.
And voice notes, they're huge. Voice notes.
I think, too, when you talk about estate planning and what have you, that to me, the more crucial a decision is, the more important it is that it be written down so that there is as little room for interpretation as possible. We were talking about living wills the other night and medical directives about things like being kept on a ventilator, being kept on a feeding tube, things like that, and I don't want my family's last memories of me to be arguing in a hospital about what to do in that situation. I want them to be able to pull out a piece of paper, go, oh, this is what it says, and then just follow that, because there's enough else going on at that time that they shouldn't be having to make those decisions.
Yeah, it's a personal opinion, so of course you can throw it out, but everybody talks about greed, right? With family farm succession planning, and my personal opinion, I think a lot of it is grief. I think a lot of times because we are grieving, whether even if we had the plan laid out, you are still grieving the loss of a parent, an aunt, a sibling. You are grieving the loss of assumed opportunity, right? Maybe you thought something was going to be different than it was. You are grieving the loss of relationships because, let's all call it like stereotypically when we lose mom, the family loses glue, right? So those relationships are changing. Even if you're not fighting, it's a different dynamic. You are losing, like there's just so many things. So I always come back and say, please, please, please do not leave your children to negotiate in times of grief. And parents say, well, Anessa, I don't want to control from the grief. And I say, absolutely not. But, that's where we'll have things on here where it kind of puts them in a box a little bit for, usually we say one crop cycle, like 3 years, just to say, okay, nobody can take their land and sell it. Nobody can do these things, right? Like the farm business has to have access to these assets. Their machinery line is dependent on it, right? Everything, just kind of keep things steady for 1 year, even 2, 3. And then, because I say if they negotiate in times of grief, then of course people grieve so differently. You have, we've all seen it. Some people that they're on top of it. They're booking the caterer, they're booking the, they're making sure everybody's okay, and they're just like superwoman or superman and controlling everything, and then they fall apart a year or 3 years later. We don't know, right? Like, and then you have the people that are like, well, I can't get out of bed, I'm distraught, and you're like, well, that's funny, I still have to go feed the cows, right? And then resentment starts, right?
And the goal, like you said earlier, is you're not controlling things from the grave, but these discussions have already been had, so you're not having a surprise. It's not that someone pulls out a will and finds out something that they didn't know, and all of a sudden what you thought was going to be the truth is no longer the truth, or the reality of the situation is different than you expected. So if the conversations have been had before, then you have that opportunity to grieve without also, there's lots of logistics in those weeks and months afterwards, but hopefully not too many surprises.
Yeah, and like, again, I caveat that, which I differ from many advisors. So again, it's just an opinion of transparency of concepts depending on age and stage, because a lot of the noise out there is that as soon as you go and update your will, you should put it on the kitchen table and everybody gets to see it and talk about it, and that's the openest part. I have seen more shit shows from, I was told I was going to get quarter A, and then the will was read and I got quarter B. I still got a quarter, free and clear, but, I got this quarter, and, was there elder abuse? Was there, why did you get that quarter? You guys put irrigation on that quarter, and knowing that I should have got it, so that's why you flipped it this way. Like, so I'm really big on, transparency of concepts. For example, is like, yes, some land maybe will be going, for example, to non-farm children, but I'm not saying southeast of the 33rd yet, unless you're at that stage, because that's a dance. You can't die at 96 and I don't know as the successor if it's southeast or not, because I'm not going to put, well, that's sounding very mean, but, am I going to put a huge irrigation pivot on a quarter that I'm not going to own in the future? No.
Right. Yeah. If you have no idea that that's going to be yours, then you wouldn't invest in it.
That's where, again, I differ from some, but I am adamant on transparency of concepts at all times.
Anessa, I will say that our lawyer brought up that one thing he has put in wills, and it is in ours, is that the first person to really pitch a fit about who gets what doesn't get anything. And he said, is it enforceable? Probably not. Will it slow their roll about fussing and fighting over stuff? Yes. And that tends to, and them knowing that is what's in the will, tends to slow people down substantially.
Yeah. Here in Canada, there's provincial stipulations on enforceability. Of course, not sure in the States how that works, but the no contest clause for sure. And again, I think, I sit with families and we go through these risks and, all of this. And I think to me, it does nothing but drive home transfer while alive. Because we circle and we circle and say, well, what if they challenge it? And what if they contest it? And we put this no contest clause in there, but they don't care. And now, we've paid so much money in legal fees and things like that. And there's such this fear because you hear that in communities and things like that. And I'm like, well, this goes away if the majority of the wealth is transferred before you pass away.
Right. If you're just deciding who gets the jewelry and a few pieces in your house, then that's a different conversation.
Mm-hmm. And again, at a responsible time, I'm not talking about doing this when they're 18, of course, and things like that. But, there was an example. I wasn't part of it, but it just kind of went through the rumor mill, that you have to update your wills. So that's why, again, we check in. Because dad had transferred the land to the farming, a quarter land to the farming son. Everything had been done perfectly, legally, I's dotted, T's crossed. But of course, in the will, it still said that southeast of the 33rd went to somebody else. Because it was an old will. So then that started a court case, right? It didn't go anywhere because he transferred of sound mind. And, but they still had to go through that stress and fees and everything else. So
yeah, the lawyers definitely get paid in that situation.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I find all of these and taxes again, usually there's, the UK, I think, shook the entire world when they brought in, or England for sure brought in their caps on the rollover rules and things like that. So that's when we can use tax to some advantages of again, proactively transferring with seatbelts is what I call it. So how can we transfer equity while alive? But, I kind of usually talk about those 60s as seatbelt provisions to mitigate that midterm step.
I feel like we've covered a lot of good stuff today, and maybe we should wrap it up for now. I feel like we could probably have another full episode, but we'll just keep going and going. And Katie's had a couple little visitors already in her room today. She's got people home.
My kids lost the remote 3 days ago, and so now they need my phone anytime they want to watch TV.
So, Katie, do you want to wrap up with our usual finale question?
So, Anessa, we ask all of our guests, if you were going to dominate a category at the county fair, what would it be? And categories can be real or made up to ensure that you win.
I would dominate trail class, probably.
For our I'm guessing that's a horse thing. Sorry, I'm not from the West. For our non-Westerners, what does that mean?
Yeah, where they set up to mirror obstacles and water and opening and closing gates and things like that, like what you do on your horseback, and who can do it with the most finesse, basically. On my old gelding, my new mare, we'd probably be kicked out of the fair, but working on it.
She'd do it fast but not accurate. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, we'd get the fastest time, that's for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Anessa, for joining us today. If people want to contact you online, where should they find you?
Yeah, my website, Peak, as in Mountain Peak, PEAK, consulting.com. There's lots of, there's background, of course. There's also contact info, and then there's also some free resources and also other articles and stuff I've written just for people to kind of get a feel of how I work.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you very much for having me. I was so excited. I want to hear more about your cruise. I was listening to your podcast yesterday. So no, thank you for what you guys are doing for the industry. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so important to have these conversations. And like you said, with the succession scars, I'm sure there's lots of families out there that have them and want to swing the pendulum and do it in a different way. It doesn't have to be a full swing, but yeah, to do things that hopefully will keep our farms and families intact if that's possible. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think just sneaking it in, I think it's a very stereotypical sexist comment, but as women, we carry a lot, right, in these conversations because we carry so much emphasis on the family side, also daughter-in-laws, moms, all of those. I know I'm the middle person between my husband and my parents, right, all that. So I think connection is so needed, and community and power. And my final thing is, you can have it all, but you cannot be Superwoman and do this all yourself. You need that team of support.
That is a great point. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Barnyard Language. If you enjoy the show, please support us on Patreon with a donation.
Big thanks go out to our show editor, Krista Paffrath at the Rural Podcast Network.
Please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen and follow the show so you never miss an episode.
If you want to connect with other farming families, join the private Barnyard Language Facebook group.
We are always in search of future guests for the podcast. If you or someone you know would like to chat with us, get in touch.